Hey, folks. Hey, I am the person who has to let everyone into their individual rooms, so I'll be back. Tim, I'm making you the host.
Okay.
There's a waiting room. So, well, actually, let me make Amanda the co-host and then make you the host. There's a waiting room. So whenever you're ready at 11, you can let them in, but don't feel pressure to do that before then. I will try to be back in like very quickly.
Oh, wait, will we have control of the waiting room?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, hold on. Helen's call. I'll be back.
Okay. You're on mute, Amanda.
Jesus, I keep unmuting myself, and then like for some reason I was on for a while, and then I literally just stepped away to go to the restroom for one last. I don't know why I forget the kind of stuff when I'm on Zoom. Yeah.
The when nature calls stuff, you mean?
Well, I mean, just in general. I'm sorry, I don't mean that specifically. I mean like self-care things, like get up, move around.
Yeah, exactly.
I just
that's secondary in these kind of situations, which is not ideal.
Yeah.
And not an example of critical practices of care.
No, exactly. And that's what was like, I was laughing as I was going through the presentation and my notes, one last time I kind of joked and I thought, boy, that's really good taking care of yourself, Amanda, is that, like go refill your water bottle, go to.
No matter what I do to try to like get all this stuff out of the way, it always ends up being a frantic mad dash to the the start time. It's
yeah.
I mean that's just part of life, and for me, and that there's always my spouse calls it dilly dallying that happens too much, where
I get lost. I hear you.
I forget to eat. Oh no, I forgot to use the bathroom. Oh no, and now I have to sit here. But this time, are we recording, by the way? We are.
Oh well. And can we stop recording?
Hey, this is all part of it.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, but anyway, so yes, that's the rushing to it. So how did anything? I know you can't like speak freely, but is everything okay with your presentation?
And we're live.
All right. So hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming to our session. We will be talking a little bit about critical disability studies as a critical practice of care in art making, teaching, and research. And so most of this conversation is just going to be a dialogue about how critical disability studies informs the work that we do. And we'll share a little bit about our own lived experience and talk a little bit about how this influences the way that we teach. And so we have a little PowerPoint that we're going to share with you guys. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with full screen.
Oh dear.
Maybe.
How do I do this?
It's the day of technical challenges, I've noticed.
Whoops.
If you go into present mode, you can click the little buttons at the bottom.
Yeah. I just went into, oh dear.
That's the opposite.
Pause record.
I can always trim it out.
Doing it. I'm just refreshing it because I don't know what I just did. Let me stop sharing for a second. I've never done this for, there we go. Okay. Start over again.
All right, we got it.
Sorry about that.
So welcome. to disability studies as critical practices of care in art making, teaching, and research. We're going to talk a little bit about how disability studies informs our work as educators, artists, and researchers.
So
you can go to the next slide.
maybe we should start because the next slide is me. So I'll just introduce myself. And to start, we're all going to be giving these kind of medical record style lists of our diagnoses over our lives. And of course, for me, my name is Tim Smith, and I am a university teacher at, or what am I? University lecturer at Aalto University. And I am the director of the university-wide art studies program. And I'm in Finland right now. And so it's a little later for me, but we are I'm just glad we're all able to come together in this symposium, no matter where we are in the world. So, and of course, critical disability studies really does, helps me embrace this kind of contradiction that this medical model does not really define my identity, but it's more the ableist barriers and constraints in society and institutions that make the effects of these disorders more magnified, more challenging in everyday experiences. And this is kind of in line with the spirit of my own experience with disclosing these medical diagnoses, and why I was really so fearful to discuss them for most of my life in an academic environment. And I guess I see this kind of clinical presentation of my medical record as something that is more cathartic than anything else. I mean, in a sense, it's just saying like, hey, let's just get this out there and out of the way. And let's start with, talking about what we really want to talk about. And so I'll go to the next slide, and Alex, you can talk about your connection with this as well.
It's kind of funny to see them all written out, and I had to add some in since things have changed since the last time we made this slide. For me, I think it's kind of this funny way of addressing the fact that maybe invisible disabilities and mental health disorders aren't as recognized, in the sense that I think most of the time when I talk about my research, one of the main questions that I get is, how can you talk about these topics if you're not a person with disabilities or not a disabled person? And so there's this curiosity that happens about kind of needing to know if this person has the authority to talk about these experiences. And so I think in a very funny way, having them all listed out is a way to kind of address that out of the gate. And so that's one side of having the diagnoses card. But I think also looking at the very strange way that it kind of played out. I have moved around quite a bit and had to seek different mental health professionals and psychiatrists throughout the last 10 years. And each person kind of has their own hypothesis about what disorder I have. And so it's interesting to kind of look through this list, because you can see that I get diagnosed with some things, and then at some point they gets ruled out, and then I get re-diagnosed with something similar, and then I get re-diagnosed with something else. And so this kind of journey, I think, encapsulates the challenges of having mental health disorders or invisible disabilities, or things that are maybe complicated and complex in a way that a simple title doesn't really cover. And so this is just a very interesting way to kind of display that journey, I think.
Hi, my name is Amanda, and like you heard from Tim and Alex, this is just my sort of basic encapsulated medical model of my disability. And I too have spent a lifetime, or almost a lifetime, of undergoing what I didn't realize at the time was passing, the concept of passing, which Alex is going to talk to you a little bit about. And I've been able to sort of step in and out of different communities because of my disabilities. One specifically is physical disabilities as a result of having a very, very serious accident in 1991 that put me in a wheelchair for some time, and I've had 5 surgeries to subsequently make corrections to my leg, and will continue to for the rest of my life, for as long as I can hang on to my leg, along with a lot of other related issues. And like Alex, I have moved around a fair bit, and also because of my age, have experienced different generations of how disability is looked at, in terms of by the medical profession. When I was young, it was okay to diagnose someone as clumsy. I'm not kidding. Like, I had that diagnosis and the prescription was ballet lessons. So like, you can't, by the doctor, because in the 70s, or in the early 80s, you had to, certain things with your child that may be now diagnosed as something wildly different. They were just diagnosed as being clumsy. So, I don't want to speak too long on this, but this medical record as it's detailed here is just one very, very small part of my identity, but it has greatly informed, not only in the way in which I've perceived the world as a student, but the way in which I've engaged in the world as a learner, and in the way that I make choices as an educator, and in the way that I make choices as an artist.
Great. All right. So I'm going to start with, well, actually, maybe Alex, you can.
Sure.
We could all talk about this.
I can start. So just an overview about what critical disability studies is. It's interdisciplinary scholarship, and it's the central purpose of disability studies specifically is to reverse the negative connotations of disability, but this pursuit tends to involve disability as an identity formation rather than a physical or mental characteristic. Critical disability studies builds off of this a little bit, but with more of an emphasis on intersectionality. And it differs from other disciplines that focus on individuals with disabilities because it aims to destabilize the authoritative voice and replace it with the voice of the individual. Prior to the integration of critical disability studies, many people with disabilities were being spoken about rather than listened to. And it's important that we continue to replace that hegemonic voice with the voice of the disability community. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing here and talking about our own experiences. There's a few critical disability studies theories that come up in conversation, so it's important to touch on what those mean. Invisible disabilities is something that we refer to as physical, mental, or neurological conditions that limit a person's movements, senses, or activities that's invisible to the onlooker. Stigma is commonly accepted that certain invisible impairments, despite their invisibility, are highly stigmatized upon disclosure, whether the disclosure is voluntary or not, as in the case with epilepsy and mental health issues. So stigma is more specifically related to the way that people think about mental health and kind of the negative connotations associated with those belief systems. Passing essentially is, it allows people with invisible impairments to construct identities undefined by their stigmatized impairment. So it's basically the act of performing as though you are able-bodied in this particular instance. And then uncovering and disclosure is a way for people with invisible disabilities to contest the performance of passing. And this disclosure can be seen as powerful and transformative for individuals with invisible disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit about how that uncovering and disclosure process happened to us throughout our time as students and academics.
Yeah, and we're going to be doing this through the lenses of our experiences as artists and as educators and as researchers. So each of us will start with framing this discussion through our experience as artists. And the question that we all are working through in framing that is, how has my understanding of critical disability studies influenced the work that I create as an artist? So I will go first just to discuss the artist part of our lives. And I'm going to start with the discussion of an ongoing large-scale project I've been working on for about 4 years now. And it started from my interest in diagrams. And of course, diagrams are drawings that are ostensibly intended to strictly convey information. And this work here comprises over 6,000 collage diagrams at this point. And it's continually growing. And I set aside a little bit of time to work on it, at least 2 or 3 days a week these days. And I search for diagrams online from various databases and add a few at a time to this massive collage. And a couple of years ago, I displayed this collage in its printed form for an exhibition in Helsinki. And back then it was about a third of the size as it would be if I printed it now. And it was about 200 by 250 inches at that point. So you get a bit of an idea of the scale. So like I said, diagrams are technical drawings. They're intended to convey information, whether it's scientific information or as a description in an instruction manual or as an illustrative chart. And I'm particularly interested in medical and scientific diagrams or patent diagrams that are connected to medical devices or products that are intended to correct or enhance life experiences for disabled or chronically ill folks. And the intention of a diagram is to describe something that, describing it in a very straightforward way through a drawing, through a visual description. But in order to do that, diagrams, they can't really have any ambiguity that might be distracting from the original information conveyed, the product itself. So in this sense, when humans are involved in the image, the go-to human figures depicted in diagrams are generally white, generally male, and certainly able-bodied and seemingly able-minded. And the assumption in doing this is that the whiteness and the maleness and the ableness are invisible. So the focus can be on the actual information that's being conveyed in the depiction of the human interacting within the diagram. So really in the beginning, I just started collaging these various diagrams together, and something that initially began as self-contained, these small diagrams usually become an exercise collaging images together to twist or subvert the perceived neutrality or normality of each individual image. So when they're collaged, they become something that mutates, beyond that sense of rationality or normality. And then it really just began to sprout from there. It became this kind of uncontrollable, almost grotesque outgrowth that has been expanding ever since. And in a sense, this process really speaks to a kind of push and pull. On one hand, the artistic process is a rather obsessive and rigidly structured and repetitive routine that for me is at once calming, and that structure and rigor is really required for me to keep from falling into the chaos that neurodivergent life can often become for me. But on the other hand, this work also becomes and embraces chaos in a visual form. And if you look at it from a distance, it's indulging in that chaos, this kind of scatteredness or this seemingly uncontrollable outgrowth and explosion of these discrete, quote unquote, rational images. But then when you look up close, you see these strictly informational images becoming entangled and distorted into something that's irrational, that's nonsense. And from a critical disability studies context, irrationality and nonsense to me have these positive values. As a Deleuzian concept, nonsense is not the opposite of sense, but it's sense that is on unstable or fluid ground. And that to me really encapsulates the lived experience of disability. And so I've recently been turning these into paintings in the past past couple of years. And this is a very different pace of artistic practice compared to the large scale digital collages. So instead of the speed and intensity of collaging dozens or even hundreds of images in one sitting into a digital collage space, painting these collages really embraces the polar opposite in its analog and extremely slow process that takes hours and hours of application and many, many weeks to complete one of these paintings. Each of these is around 40 by 40 inches. They're acrylic or flash paint on canvas. And so to put it broadly, just being mindful of time here, critical disability studies allows me as an artist in one respect to embrace and work reflexively through that push and pull of living as neurodivergent in a compulsory abled society. But in another respect, through the subject matter of these source diagrams, it also works toward revealing how pervasive ableism is in its even, in that that's even ingrained in such nuanced ways, as in how it's depicted in something as seemingly benign as a pattern diagram or a medical illustration. And I'll talk more about this in the other two sections, but for now, I just want to step aside for Amanda's artist portion of the panel, and I'll still be controlling the slides, so just give me a okay or something whenever I want to move ahead.
Thanks, Alex. And Tim, thank you very much. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my artwork next. Tim, you can pull up the first slide. It's great. To give a little bit of background about my work is I am predominantly a photographer, an analog, wet lab, old school, however you want to term it, photographer. And I work serially, and I have literally since my college days. I do photo essays that can be as long as 10 years long, and usually are accompanied by a piece of creative writing as well. Usually there's an essay which speaks about the research behind my work, the story, weaves in a little bit of personal narrative. One of the reasons I found working serially and sort of came to the place of working serially in my photography was specifically my disabilities as well, and in particular my physical disabilities. Is during college I was in and out of wheelchairs, walking assistance, braces, and as a photographer lugging equipment, I really had to make choices about when I could go out into the field. When we go into the field. Because I there were times when I just couldn't work. I just couldn't carry, I just couldn't lug the equipment. So I found also the sense of time was very important in my work. My body, my physicality kept changing. Keep going, Tim. I'm sorry, you can scroll through some of these. I found just, in response to my own body, my own capabilities changing over time, I found that shifting my own work serially matched the own pace of my art making. Specifically, this series has to do with genetic ethics. And again, I also work metaphorically. So I tend to just identify something and tell the story through these images. And this story is of Appaloosas. You can keep going. The reason I chose this breed, is not only am I a lifelong horse person and have specific, I had owned an Appaloosa for 15 years, but they had a very interesting genetic story. I started this series in 2010 at the same time I started my fertility journey, only to discover I had significant genetic barriers to ever possibly being able to have children. And the Appaloosas had their own genetic journey. They were actually altered genetically, courtesy of consumerism and the desire to assimilate. The Appaloosa is known for its spotted coat, and people who didn't want to see the spots but wanted the athleticism of this wonderful breed actually bred in other breeds of horses into the Appaloosa bloodlines, and to get rid of their spots, to make them more marketable, more appealing in the horse show worlds, and to make them more consumer friendly. Unfortunately, by introducing these outside genetics, they caused two very serious health problems in the breed. One which shortens their life, courtesy of a hoof-related issue. The other one is a neurological disease that causes very sudden and painful death. And it's interesting because this breed, treasured by the Nez Perce Nation, and specifically bred to keep this spotted coat, was then taken over by us and by consumers and changed and genetically altered. And like I said, during my own sort of journey into understanding my genetics and what was causing problems with me, and my ability to have children, I started this series as well, thinking, my gosh, here's a metaphor of something that, again, by nature, we have altered. And like I said, I won't read from the essay today, but I usually write an essay. So that's the last piece in this particular series, but thank you.
I did want to say, Amanda, if you want to read your essay, I think for all intents and purposes, maybe we can just talk about the artist section today, since we only have a little bit of time and would like some Q&A. So if you do want to share your essay, I think that's okay too.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, but thank you. I'm good. I'm very good. But yes, then like I said, I wanted to share that the writing and the artwork are sort of both part of my creative process.
Okay. So yeah, we're going to go on a little bit of a journey with my artwork, starting with some of the stuff that I did in my dissertation. So a few years ago now, and we're going to go watch this transition unfold as I go into being an academic and kind of looking more specifically about how my work has reflected critical disability studies and the work that I'm currently doing. So you can go ahead to the first slide. So I started with an arts journal, and I was kind of trying to investigate how to illustrate mental health. I didn't know how to do that. And so the first thing that felt the most obvious to me was to just describe some of the challenges that I experienced. And so, and you can see that I was at the very beginning of understanding disability studies because I was using problematic language like normal. And so in the image on the left, new medication, it says, my body feels like static, this isn't normal. And it was just my way of kind of adapting to being on probably, I don't know, 50 different medications over the course of the last 10 years. And so that process was challenging for me. And the image on the right is called mental health. And it was just kind of an embodiment of that, of feeling just this whirlwind of emotions and thoughts at the same time that were often conflicting. And so through this process and the journaling, and as I kept reading about disability studies, I recognized that it's problematic that I'm framing my experience only by these kind of negative experiences. And that doesn't seem to be honest or true to the reality of what it meant to be at the time. I think I was diagnosed with just depressive disorder, and it kind of goes from there, but this didn't feel as authentic. And so you can change the slide. I started experimenting with more abstract representations of the disability experience. And so I started thinking about my different identities that also intersected with this disability identity. And the image on the left is conflicting identities, which I think kind of embodies that idea. And then the image on the right is the borderlands. And so I started thinking about Gloria Anzaldua's borderland theory, where she talks a little bit about, being part of two different cultures and kind of what it means to be on the borderlands of either identity. And so I think I identified with that a little bit about being a person with invisible disabilities, because I think there are times when I can kind of straddle that line of being able-bodied or, disabled. And so I started experimenting with more theory. I got more into watercolor and ink because I really liked the idea of fluidity. I wanted to represent something that was changing and constantly pivoting to accommodate the way that I thought and felt about my disability experience. And so on the left, I have disconnected, and then on the right, I have renegotiation. And so I think I was constantly really renegotiating my own identity as I kept kind of interrogating my experience. And so you can switch. So I started actually moving into 3D with paper sculpture because I started to realize that context plays a huge role in the way that I view my own disabilities, and environment also played a big role in that. And so I thought the best way to encapsulate those two things is to build something that's three-dimensional and something that changes shape depending on how you look at it. So both of these shapes are very irregular, and they were hanging in an exhibition. And so depending on where you're looking at the artwork, it would change shape. It would become this kind of amorphous thing. And so on the left, I have transitioning identities, and on the right, I have performative able-bodiedness. And so as I kept digging into those theories of critical disability studies, I started to really see how my understanding of my own identity as something that's more socially constructed started to influence my artwork very directly. And this is just an image of the exhibition I did for as part of my dissertation, but you can kind of see it's kind of a blurry now that it's large, but you can kind of see the progress of journaling all the way into some of my more sculptural works. And then after my dissertation, I started experimenting with alcohol ink. I thought that I was really excited about the idea of layering and fluidity and blurring lines and thinking about things as a spectrum and kind of getting rid of those binaries that we kind of hold on to in a weird way. And so I just started creating some artwork that just explored that, and it allowed me to loosen up and think a little bit about being okay with the unpredictable, which happens with alcohol ink if you've ever worked with it before. So I made a few alcohol ink images, and different ones reflect different times in my life. This one on the left, the one that looks a little angry, I did that right after I found out a friend of mine was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And so I reacted to it through art. And so I just kept building these pieces. And then eventually, I think the next slide, I did what any any curious person would do. I put it all through a shredder. And so I took those artworks and I took those pieces, and I also took my entire dissertation and I shredded it. and I made these globes out of it. And this particular piece was right when I started at Penn State, but I was kind of starting to interrogate the work that I was doing in the field and what it meant to be an academic and to be an educator. And so this one was called Purveyor of Prejudice. And I have the abstract or the description. It says, this project is an artistic exploration of what it means to be a self-reflective practitioner and how our intersecting identities and subjectivities can influence the way that we respond to difference and biases in the classroom, further investigating how we define ourselves and our practice as potential purveyors of prejudice. And so I was just kind of reconsidering my research like as a whole, and what that meant as an educator, my responsibility as an educator to constantly rethink what I'm trying to say and how I'm saying it. And then I think I have a couple more pieces since then. The piece on the left was for viral imaginations. And so I see Karen's here, so she may be able to talk a little bit about that. But I created a piece that reflected some of the feelings and thoughts I had about the pandemic. This one was called Static. And I was thinking a little bit about just really honestly, just kind of trying to keep my life together, holding on to whatever pieces I could while everything around me kind of felt like it was falling apart. I think living alone made that more difficult for sure at the beginning. So that was kind of in relation to that. And then the piece on the right was about intersecting identities and intersecting disability and gender. So we can go to the next ones. And then I think this might be my last slide, but final piece was actually a part of an article in Visual Culture and Gender, also with Karen. editing that. And so this piece was made as a way to kind of process the idea of coping and surviving during the pandemic. But I use a lot of theories in critical disability studies to inform that process. And it's you may not be able to see it in these pictures, but it's wrapped in barbed wire. And it kind of expands a little bit about how my mental health was directly impacted by the pandemic and what that looks like, and kind of thinking through some disability theory in that process. So to kind of sum it up, that was a long journey that you went on with me about my art, but essentially the artistic practice, disability studies helped me think about things more holistically. It helped me think about the context of which these experiences are happening. And it allowed me the space to be more self-reflective about what I do and how I do it. It provided the opportunity to uncover or come out as an artist and academic. And it allowed me to become a self-reflective practitioner, both in arts and education.
Great. I think maybe we could stop sharing the PowerPoint if we were going to just pause at the artist part. So we're at 54 past now, so we have a little bit of time for some discussion.
I see Karen put in the chat a link to my article, so if you'd like to.
Yes, great. And I just opened it as well, so it disrupted the slideshow.
We'll just read the article for the last 4 minutes.
Yeah, how about that? I'll just display that.
We originally had to talk a little bit about our teaching and research practice, but you know, if you ever want to know, you can just ask us.
And or read the article that we wrote together in another journal, Research in Arts and Education, which was also edited by Karen and Jen Eisenhower Richardson as well.
That feels like decades ago.
And here's that link. There we go, right on cue. Thank you.
Karen, we need to hire you. We need to hire you permanently for every presentation you give. You can drop in the chat at exactly the right moment. Everything.
I'm laughing and really realizing I'm on mute, but I'm with you all. Okay.
No, it's okay.
Thanks, Karen.
You're permanently hired as our
publicist.
Your publicist, your advocate, your supporter.
Karen can run around behind us with our bibliographies. Don't forget this.
Yeah. Thank you again for sharing your sharing with this, and I'm really glad it's recorded. It can reach more people in that way. So congratulations.
Absolutely.
The work you do. Tim, I had not seen your the paintings or the drawings, and I think just fascinating. And are many of those like very recent, or what's the span of that journey that you went with the transition you described?
Yes, the paintings are quite recent, in the past year, and so we're kind of working off of what Alex was talking about in terms of as a response to the pandemic, and creating work in response to that experience that we're all experiencing. But me, for example, with obsessive compulsive disorder and health anxiety disorder has affected me, and also actually having chronic illness that puts me at a higher risk. That's something, having all of those combined, along with just the anxieties that we are all facing, compounding in so many ways, in terms of how we approach work, how we approach family and friendships and relationships, and just going to the grocery store, or choosing to stretch that out. So we, are whether we spend this money to order something, or order something in for delivery, or or to wait out another week or two before going to the grocery store, anything like that. All of those decisions, become so very, very immediate and incredibly magnified. One sort of effect of the pandemic for me was that, all this time that I would be spending doing something else, and instead of the first month, I was basically just in this kind of mode of sort of shutting down. It's just only doing work for the university, and really just trying to get by doing that. And then at some point I was just like, I need to channel this into something else. And so that's when the diagram painting started. I had started one, the previous August, and then had kind of stepped away from it for several months. And then I picked it up again in April, and just nonstop for the past year, at least now, I've been putting out a painting once every maybe month and a half. So I have about 8 or 9 of them so far. And I have one right now that I'm just finishing up. That's right on the wall here that is much more collage connected. So and I'm still wearing my painting pants right now. I have my sweater on, my nice sweater on, but I have my painting pants on. So any chance I can get, it's kind of, it's a way to distract myself from obsessively checking the news and, thinking too much into it. But also it's something that has been a real sort of silver lining in a very horrible situation for everybody. But that's how that process is really developed. Just also slowing down. It's very meditative, and I don't want to be like cliche in any way, but it's really a therapy, form of therapy for me, to just sit down and spend a couple of hours, even if I get a half hour in. That's just such a huge stress relief from everything that's happening in the day, whether it's negotiating online teaching or negotiating all the other kind of stresses that have been so magnified in this past year.
Thank you.
We do have a lunch break after this, so we can go over a little while if that's okay. I have a direct question here from one of our participants, and they wanted to know a little bit about how you are able to do a lot more detailed oriented painting process, knowing that you may have that may be more challenging for you because of having ADD or those kinds of things. Do you find that doing something meticulous is beneficial to you, or has it been, I know you said kind of therapeutic to work through other processes, but kind of, do you want to talk about that experience and how those go together?
Yes. One thing I love about going to museums, remember when we got to do that, and can't wait to do it again. But, the one thing I loved about going to museums is when you see artwork in books, especially very kind of, like op art and, pop art, especially, where you'd see them in books and they look so crisp and so tidy and precise. And then you see them in the museum and they're, the lines are not as sharp as you thought they were. A Frank Stella painting is not these, super hard edged lines. They're very, very, the human hand is very much visible when you see them up close in ways that you just cannot see them in art books or online. And so if you did look up close, you would see that these are, as much as I really map them out, I grid these out, and I do all of the collages in Photoshop before I actually transfer them to canvas. But they're very much not very pristine. And I think that gives me that flexibility and makes me feel like, well, it's okay to not have that be a perfect circle, or not have that be a very sharp line. And I stopped using rulers and I stopped using painter's tape to create hard edge lines. And I just went with my hand. And so it's been actually very freeing, because that's something that has, I become kind of a perfectionist in that way. And instead of doing it over and over and over again, I end up just letting it go. And so it's given me that chance to kind of, go with the flow if something goes in a direction that I didn't expect it to, to end up. So yeah, thanks for that question. That's really, that is part of that process, definitely.
I think I experienced something kind of similar when I started diving into alcohol ink, because you can try to control it, but it really has a mind of its own. And
Right.
letting go of those boundaries, and in your mind, you're like, I want it to do this thing. And if it doesn't do it, you go, all right, well, we'll adapt and
Mm-hmm.
make it into something else. So learning
And
to
I
let
think
go.
about
Hard.
Amanda's photography. Like, that's something where I was trained as a photographer. I got my master's in photography, but I just cannot. I'm too. Dark room was something that was such a struggle for me, and so I see the beautiful values in Amanda's work, and I know how much attention to detail that takes. So that's something that I really, and seeing it on the screen like that is really just beautiful to see. So that's something that I certainly note in Amanda's work as well.
No, I mean, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I just, I see my process as fulfilling very similar spaces that your processes fill for you in your lives, but with a very different technical process and outcome. For me, I feel like everything else in my life has been out of control, things that I couldn't control. I couldn't control my genetics and my inability to have children, which destroyed my life. I couldn't control the accident that I had. It was a tragic, unexpected accident that can happen to anybody when they're 17 years old, like so many things. And that set off so many uncontrollable elements. Now, I was always into photography. Even in high school, I went to a high school with a lab, with a black and white lab. So it was very intuitive space for me. I've always loved the camera. But when I literally or when I acquired my physical disability, it was almost like a challenge to me, is going to college in a wheelchair and being a photographer and having to figure out how I'm going to take pictures. How am I going to get into the labs? This is before 1995, before ADA even existed. My photography professor threw me out of my class, my first year in college, threw me out of my photo class because he said I couldn't get around the darkroom safely. And this was allowed in 1991. So, I look at my photography as a reclaiming of my control and my process and my sort of methodology that I like to go through to get those perfect, balance of grades, the softness. I shoot specifically with Ilford and HP5 plus films that give grain, and you can feel the texture of the environment. For me, that's the control that I can get back using the process of photography, because it is so precise. When you move me into art forms, which I've studied extensively in my undergraduate and all my graduate, other art forms too, everything from stone carving to welding, you name it, but I didn't have the sense of control and process, as well as the feeling that I could document over time. For me, time has meant a lot. My life has changed so much over time as a result of many different things in my life. And for me, working serially in photography allowed me to just have that time of dipping in and out, of taking images for a series that had a strong metaphor at that time in my life. So like I said, it's fulfilled similar purposes, but the method of making was very different for me, but filled a very specific need in my life of being able to gain control and have control.
Yeah. I think as well, like, that control is something that I feel that sort of safety of using acrylic paint or flash paint, which is a vinyl paint that is very, very opaque. So you can cover up anything very easily. And so that's what makes me feel so much more also impressed in what Alex is doing with the watercolor and ink, and then the alcohol paint, or is it alcohol ink, right? And ink.
Alcohol ink.
That's something where it's that relinquishing of control is, or being okay with that loss of control, is something that I still have that real hesitance to delve in, because I have watercolors, but I haven't been using them at all. My spouse has been using them instead, and but I'm just staying away from it. So I really admire that trusting of that sort of the unpredictability of the material that you're using. And I guess that really, and that certainly connects to what you're, how the lens that you're working through in art as a way of articulating that to yourself.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually encourage, and it's funny, I think about my own art form, and I encourage almost the opposite when I'm teaching teachers, is we do so much material exploration, so much like opening up the opportunity for students to find their own narratives by exploring and combining materials in totally different ways. When I'm doing my K-12 education, and I was able to do that, and that's how I taught as an art teacher. But my own artistic practice is, yes, I do love playing with materials, but my safe space is the dark room. So it's really interesting. I sometimes coach a little bit of the opposite in what I do, but I realize my own artistic practice and its outcomes and its process are really specific to me and my narrative and my identity. So I can't necessarily foist those as best practices for all. I do know that materials exploration and what you all are both speak about, which is just the freeing up of not knowing what the outcome could be, is extremely enlivening and reassuring. And I do love encouraging that for my teachers to push forward in their curriculum in their K-12 classrooms.
Great. Yeah, I feel like since we're almost 10 minutes over, we probably should wrap up. I feel I can continue this conversation forever, but I do know people probably need to go eat and things like that. Karen encouraged us to come to her presentation after. She presents at 2:30 in the same room on viral imaginations. So that will be very interesting. So I encourage everyone to go to that. Scott, do you have any questions, any more questions, or do you feel like they were answered? Okay. Great. All right. Well, does anybody have any final comments, or do we feel good about where we are?
I think that's great. We can maybe stop the recording.
Oh,